So last week we talked about CSS. We focused on color for both foreground and background color. We also talked about typography, so getting like fonts in there and type sizes and type weights. And then we also talked about boxes and how we can add styles to the boxes around the content, play around with the border of those boxes, the padding, the margin, etc. This week, we're going to be talking about playing around with CSS and using lists, tables, and forms with CSS, as well as images. And we're going to talk about how we can create the layout that we want using CSS as well. So positioning of different elements on the web page. The first thing we're going to talk about are lists. So lists, again, in HTML, there's ordered lists and unordered lists, and descriptive lists or definition lists, actually. With CSS, just like with every other HTML element, you just declare the CSS element or declare the HTML element in your CSS, and then you can apply styles to it. So if you wanted to change the style of the actual like bullet points to be, or the numbering to be like lower Roman values, you could do that with ordered lists. So instead of numerical values like 1, 2, 3, it could be Roman characters. So you could change the styles of the bullet points essentially with CSS. So there's a number of different options. For unordered lists, you can get rid of the bullets completely. You can add a disk bullet, you can add a circle, and you can add a square in CSS. For ordered, you can do decimal points, decimal with 0 in front of it, alpha, lower alpha, upper alpha, lower Roman numerals, and upper Roman numerals. So there's a lot of different options when it comes to different list styles. If you wanted to go beyond that, then you could also substitute the actual bullet or the number. Actually, I think the bullet with an image. So here we're doing unordered lists and applying a list style image, and then just passing the URL for where that image lives. We could also add margin around the list bullet points. So if the star image is like too large or something and we wanted to add some more space in between the bullet points, then we could add margin at the top or bottom or wherever we want it around the bullet point. So this is what it would look like with an image replacing the bullet point. And then because the star is larger than the bullet points, maybe we wanted to add some space here, so we added some margin in between each bullet. So you can also play around with the positioning of the bullet points. So you play around with the width of the entire list. You can play around with the margin of each bullet. We can change the position of where the bullet lives, whether it's outside or inside of the list and the text itself. So here are two options for the bullet being outside and the text being completely aligned from the top line down. And then on the inside, the text is kind of be indented on the first line, and then all the text below is going to be in line, lined up with the bullet point itself. So that's the difference between outside and inside bullet points. So with this, there's also a bit of shorthand if you wanted to add some shorthand. So there's like list style. You can say, I want the bullet inside and it to be a circle. So rather than having 2 lines of CSS code, you can have it all on one with the list style declaration. So it's going to be inside and the bullet point is going to be a circle. Cool. So why don't we play around with that a little bit more in Glitch. So let's go back to glitch.com and let's just create a new project. Okay, I'm just going to delete everything again. Let's just start from scratch. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is just create a new file, and we always need to start with our index.html file. Let's add that file. And let's create another file, our style.css file. This could be called anything you want it to be called. It doesn't have to be style. It could be style sheets. It could be I don't know, whatever you want, but it makes the most sense to call it something like style or something related to that. So let's add that file as well. Okay, so index.html, we just need to add our HTML, add a head. Let's give it a title, week 10, web design 1, CSS 2. And add body. So the next thing I want to do is add the CSS to our HTML file. So let's link that. href is going to be equal to style.css. Type is text CSS. And the real is going to be style sheet. Okay. So I'm just going to add, let's do H1 for a title. Let's call this web design 1, week 10, CSS 2. So we got a header. So let's just add some style to our CSS for H1. And let's give this a font family. I think that's right, Arial. Can have some backups. And sans serif. Okay, so that should change. Can add some styles to the body too. Let's add a background color, yellow. Cool, so it should be changing on the right-hand side as well as you kind of type your CSS. If it is, then we know that our CSS is linked properly. If it's not, then we know that something's wrong. Okay, cool. Okay, so since we're playing around with lists, let's just go ahead and play around with that. So let's do an unordered list. Add some bullet points. I'm just going to add some gibberish here. Doesn't really matter. Just something like long enough so it goes to the next line. Let's give this a class too. It's probably a good idea to do that. So for unordered list, let's give it a class name of gibberish. So I gave it a class name of gibberish. So we can reference both the HTML tag of UL, but we can also reference the class name of gibberish in our CSS. So it's good to have classes because if we have multiple unordered lists in our code, in our HTML, and they're all going to have different styles, like maybe I want to use an unordered list for my navigation. Maybe I want to use an unordered list just as like bullet points. Those two unordered lists will probably look different based off of the CSS that I'm going to attach to it. So it's always good to have classes and attached to HTML tags that are more likely going to be used multiple times throughout your HTML file. Okay, so now we have our gibberish class associated to that. So let's say UL, and then we could say specifically the UL that has the class gibberish. Should probably use a word that I could spell. But that's okay. Just copy and paste it. That's right. Okay. So when we use a class that's associated to a specific tag, then we reference the tag, then use the dot to represent the class, and then reference the name of the class. It would still work if we just reference the class by itself, just like that. But if that class is being used for multiple tags. If it's fine if all those HTML tags get the same style, but if you don't want it to get the same style, then you have to be more specific and say only the UL tags that have the class gibberish associated to it should get these styles. Okay, so let's give this some style. Let's give it a font family of do Arial as well. Okay, probably makes more sense to have the font family in the body, so then it applies to everything. So then we could say, let's just give H1. If we delete that, then it's applying font family Arial to everything. Let's give H1 a color, just so it has something. Okay, it's looking very, very 90s website design going on right now. Okay, so now everything gets the Arial, Verdana, sans serif font family associated to it. That's in body. And then let's give the bullet points a color of orange. Then let's also play around with the different list styles. So we could do list style type and square. So then the bullets turn to squares. You can also do is it disk and circle. And that's just an outline of a circle. We change the size, obviously. Type size. Let's do 21 pixels. Sorry, I think it's font size. Yeah. So font size 21 pixels. So it's just bigger. That's a little too big. Why don't we make it smaller? Let's do 14. You can also do list position. So let's do list style position. And by default, it's going to be outside, but if we want it to be inside, do that too. So then the bullets are inside. Let's give this a padding 0 pixels. So let's go going flush to the left-hand side. So I'm actually applying these styles to the unordered list and not the actual bullet point, the list LIs. So you can see that a lot of this is being passed to the LIs too. But if I wanted to add like space in between each bullet point, then I would have to say, okay, let's say ul.gibberish li. So this is going to the unordered lists with the class name gibberish, and then looking for all the LIs. I'm going to say margin on the top, let's do 10 pixels. Then right is going to be 0 pixels, bottom 0 pixels, and left 0 pixels. So add some space in between each bullet point. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is playing around with styles with tables. So it's unlikely that you guys are going to be using tables on your personal websites or whatever websites that you're building, but it's possible. Tables are meant for displaying columns and rows of data and information. And just like with every other HTML element, you can apply different styles to it. So you can play around with like the width of the entire table or each individual cell or row or column. You can play around padding of the cells themselves, do text transformations and letter spacing, change font size. You can play around the border around each cell. You can play around text alignment, background color, and you can also play around with hover. There's a lot of different styles that you can apply to tables with CSS. So here we have a table with a table data style associated to it. So all the table data cells are going to have a border of 1 pixel. That's going to be solid and going to be this like blue tint. It's going to each one is going to have some padding of 15 pixels around it. And then we have 2 classes, 1 and 2, associated to 2 different tables. So 1 is going to have empty cells being shown, and 2 is going to hide any empty cells. So if there's no content in the cell, then it's going to either show it or hide it. So here, there's nothing in the cell, but it's still being shown. Over here, there's nothing in the cell, but it's been removed, so you can't see it. You can also play around with the gaps in between each cell. So if you wanted to have more spacing in between each cell, you can say border spacing for tables. This one is 5 pixels on the top and bottom and 15 pixels on the left and right. This one is using the border collapse declaration, and it's saying collapse the spacing. So that means there's not going to be any spacing in between the cells. So this one has 15 pixels and 5 pixels spacing. And then this one has borders collapsed. So there's no spacing in between each cell. I don't think we need to do that demo, since the majority of you aren't going to be using tables on your sites. Same thing with forms. I'm not sure how many of you are going to be using forms, since we're not talking about PHP and how to actually get the forms working. But just like with everything else, you could style the forms too. So you can change font size, color, background color, border radius, hover and focus styles. You can have a background image in the form. You can add padding and margin, etc. for the input fields. You can also style the button by changing the color, the text shadow, border, the background color, border radius, and the hover state as well. And then you could also play around with like alignment and the kind of layout of the form itself by playing around with declarations like floats, text alignment, padding, margin. So to go from this, which is kind of like not very clean and not aligned, and there's not a lot of space in between each section, to this that has like divider lines and some padding and margin around all the content. Everything's kind of aligned. So you can play around with the look and feel and style of the form itself with CSS. There's also different styles that you could apply to the cursor itself. So if you wanted to change the type of icon that the cursor is when you hover over a certain area. So if you want to change the cursor to like the move icon or the pointer, which looks like a little finger, you can do that as well. So like when someone hovers over like a button on a form, it could change to the pointer finger icon to indicate that you can like click on it, essentially. So this is changing the cursor to the move icon, which ultimately would indicate that you can move an element around the screen. Why don't we just play around with that? Because I think everything else isn't really too applicable for the projects you're going to be working on, but I think we could play around with the cursor. It might be kind of fun. So let's try that first. Okay, so let's say when we hover over the header, so let's say H1 hover. Let's change the cursor to be the move icon. So now when you hover over the header, you can see that changes to the little move icon. It's really small, but you can kind of see it. Then when I hover over anything else, it goes back to the arrow. So there's a lot of different options for that too. Let me see if I can find some more. So let's see, let's try some other ones. Let's try crosshair. So then it turns into that crosshair icon. Try, there's a help one. Turns into the question mark when you hover over it. So there's a lot of different options that you could play around with when it comes to the cursor icon, either on hover or just all the time. You can change it to a different icon. I believe you could also change the change it to an image too. So the next thing I want to talk about are images. So with CSS, you can change the width and height of images, just like in the HTML element as well. There's width and height. You can do that with CSS. It's usually better to do all that with CSS rather than directly in the HTML, because if you need to change it like on hover or change it for certain parameters or reasons, it's better to do that with CSS than in the HTML element itself. So we have 3 classes for 3 different images. So we have large, medium, and small. So any image, HTML image tag that has large, medium, or small is going to be assigned these styles, these width and height values. So this can be 500 by 500, 250 by 250, and 100 by 100. So this has the style large associated to it. This has the style medium associated to it. Sorry, this has the class large associated to it. This has the class medium associated to it, and this has a class small associated to it. You can also play around with the alignment of the images with the text that it's next to. You can do this with HTML directly, but again, it's always better to do any stylistic modifications to your website in CSS. To align to the left of your text, then you would use float text. It's going to float the image to the left. To the right, you'd use float right. And then we just added some margin on the right and left, so there's some space in between the image and the text itself. To center objects, to center images, you can use the margin 0 pixels for the top and bottom, and then auto on the left and right. But you have to display this as a block element. So anything that is an inline element, like an image or anything like that, has to be displayed as a block element, and then you can align it center on the screen. This is just some styles for the width and height of the image. So now this image is a block element and it's center aligned in the browser window. You can also do background images. So if you want to have like a pattern behind your content, a pattern behind your text, you can add a background image by using the declaration background image, giving it the value of URL and then where that image lives. So this has some background imagery behind this text for this pattern graphic behind all the content. By default, the background image is just going to be repeated along the X and Y axis, but you can customize that if you just want to repeat along the X axis or the Y axis, or not repeat at all. Those are options using the background repeat declaration, and then setting that to repeat X is just going to repeat on the X axis. Repeat Y is just going to repeat on the Y axis. And then I think no repeat is not going to repeat at all. It's just going to show the image once. So here it is on the X axis. It's kind of like a background for the header at the top. And this is just a repeated image over and over and over again. So you could also have fixed background images. So if you didn't want the background image to scroll with the content and just kind of stay there, be stationary, then you could say background attachment fixed, and it'll just stay fixed there as you scroll down. Like I said, you could also do no repeat if you don't want to have the image repeated in the background. So that's an option. But because this is a fixed image, background image, as you scroll through the content, the flower is always going to be in the same location. It's not going to scroll with the rest of the content. You could also play around with the positioning of the background image. So background position is the declaration, and the value associated to it can be 2 values. could be center, which is going to be along the x-axis, and then top is going to be the y-axis. So if this was center center, then it would be directly in the middle of the screen. Center top is going to be centered on the x-axis and then top aligned to the top of the browser. You can also do percentages. So it doesn't have to be text here. You can use percentages. So if you want it to be like 20% from the left-hand side and 50% from the top, then it'd be 20% and 50%. So here's center top aligned. And just like with some other declarations, you can do shorthand. So instead of doing like background image and background repeat and background color, you could say just background, pass a color, pass an image, say repeats or no repeats, and then pass the position, so top right. So this is just shorthand to do something that you would normally do in like 5 or 6 lines of CSS. And this is what it looks like. So if you wanted to like design and customize your own button using images, that's an option too. It's usually better to avoid using images if you can just use CSS. That is preferable, mainly because images the link can break. The time it takes for an image to load is longer than just CSS. So it's better if you just use CSS for especially like buttons. But you can do hover states and kind of image sprites with button options too. So here we have image sprites for add to basket and frame options for on load, on hover, and then on click. And basically all you're going to do is apply each image to the background of an A tag or like a div or something like that. And then on like hover, on active, you're going to change the background position of that image. So the entire, all 3 images are going to be loaded in one image file, ideally. And then when you hover over it or click on it, it's going to change the position of what it's displaying in that box. So that box is only displaying like the size for one button to be shown, one button graphic to be shown. So when you hover over it, it's going to change the position down. So the second graphic is going to be shown. And then when we click on it to activate the button, then it's going to shift down again to show the top graphic. So this is what it looks like kind of in the browser. On load, it's just going to be show the top graphic, the load graphic, and everything else is kind of hidden outside of this box or underneath this box, and just this box area is displaying the visible content. So as you hover over it, it's going to move the graphic up to display the hover image. And as you click on it, it's going to move the graphic up again to display the active image. But again, I would highly suggest trying to do all of your buttons in CSS rather than using images. Shall we play around with images a little bit? All right, so let's find a background pattern. Let's just say pattern. And I don't know what looks cool. Let's do something that can repeat like over and over again. So maybe this one. Let's try that one. And let's save image as, and call it pattern. Save it to the desktop. Go back to glitch, upload that image as an asset. Okay, we got that. Set grab that link, so copy the link to where that image lives, go back to our CSS, and let's just add that background image to our body. Whoa, okay. Okay, so let's play around with background size. Let's do 20% maybe. Okay, made it smaller. Let's do background repeats on the x-axis. All right, it's kind of cool. Make it a little bigger. Let's do 25%. So because it's percentages, it's going to change based off of the width and height of the browser window. So maybe let's not do percentages and let's do pixels. There we go. So that's kind of crazy look, but it works. Let's do something else. Let me try one that's less painful on the eyes. Try this one. Okay. All right, let's upload that one too. Pattern 2. Copy. And let's replace this one, the other one. Paste. There we go. It's better. Also do, let's see, background position. We do center. That's going to be center aligned. Do center top. It'll be back where it was. We do center bottom. Go to the bottom. So yeah, you play around with it. Let me try like a hover state too for images. That might be helpful. So let's add a div here. Let's call it class called project. So if you're doing like a portfolio site and you have like lots of different images for thumbnails that you want to use to click on, then we could say, okay, we're going to use a div here called project. Let's give that some project a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels. Just give it a background color so we could see what's going on there. Okay, so we have a box here. And let's say I have like, let's get another image here. Load that. Okay. Copy that. Okay, and then I could say background image URL. Okay, so we have that background image there. But if we wanted to have like a hover state or something, say hover state, let's just use that one. Okay. So let's say when we hover over this, we want the image to change to like a different view of the project, or have text on top of it or something like that. So when we hover over it, it'll change the image to a different thumbnail. So on hover, we're just changing the background image. So this is very similar to like the button sprite example I just talked about. But instead of moving the position of the graphic, we're just replacing the image with a different image on hover. This isn't ideal because when you hover over it, then it needs to load in that image. So if it's a large image, then might take a minute, and you might see like a flash or something before it's loaded in. So that's why it's better to have the hover state and the load state graphic to be on the same image file. So then everything loads in on load, and it's just moving it down and moving it up depending on what you want to be visible. But this is fine. This works too, especially with today's computers and the speed of everything. So when it comes to figuring out how to build the layout that you have designed using HTML and CSS, we have to play around with our block elements and inline elements and make sure that what we want to be inline is inline, what we want to be block is block. And if something is not, then we have to change it. Then we can play around with the placement and the floating of different objects and how they are organized on the screen and then the layout. So it's good to think about our sections as being contained in a box and kind of organized based off of what goes where. So it's good to have a containing element at the top for like our header. It's good to have a containing element for our main content. And then it's also smart to have a containing element for our footer at the bottom too. That's pretty standard when it comes to most websites, to have a header with like a navigation and a logo in the top. Then main content holds like all the meat and potatoes of our website. And then footer normally has like contact information, copyright information. So all that like necessary stuff that is sometimes required on most websites. So when it comes to controlling the positioning of these different elements, we have to play around with floating different objects. So this is a normal flow of the header elements, H1 or something. Then we have some body copy, and it looks like it's like flowing normally. We can play around with the positioning of different objects as well. So that was normal flow. This is relative positioning. So this paragraph is, we're changing the positioning of it relatively to the objects that were before it. So this is moving it left, moving it to the right and down based off of this paragraph above it. There's also absolute positioning, where it's absolutely always going to be in that area until you scroll. So this is going to be absolutely on top of this paragraph. But if you scroll, then it's also going to scroll with it. Versus fixed positioning, which is similar to absolute positioning, but it's always going to be there. It's never going to scroll. It's always going to be in that position on your screen. So once you have the positioning figured out, whether you want to be fixed or absolute or relative or normal flow, then you can start playing around with floating elements to like the left and right of each other. So for floating elements, we can float like div containers or H1 containers to the left or right of our content. And any inline elements are just going to like flow around it. So we're going to play around with positioning as well as floating elements to create the layout that we want to have on our website. So this is just a normal flow of content. There's just this kind of what happens when we're not changing the positioning or floating any objects. This is pretty standard, just things are on top of each other and then flowing to the next block, the next line in our HTML. So we have a body, the width is 750 pixels, I have a font family and a color for the text. Our H1 has a background color, this like gray, has some padding around it. And then our paragraphs all have a width of 450 pixels. So we have our header at the top, some paragraphs that are 450 pixels, and the width of the entire thing is going to be like 750, I believe. So that was normal flow, which is what we normally get. That's what we've been working with so far. But we could also play around with different positioning. In this case, we're going to play around with relative positioning. So again, this is changing the position of this paragraph that has the example class and moving it 10 pixels from the top down and 100 pixels from the left to the right. But it's based off of the relative position of where it is. So it's going to move based off of the paragraph or the content presented before it. So this is moving 10 pixels down from this paragraph, the previous paragraph, and 100 pixels from the left based off of where it started initially. So that's relative positioning. We're changing the position of it based off of where it is relatively to the other content. Absolute positioning is positioning it absolutely in the browser window. So it's not based off of where it is in the HTML. It's just going to be positioned based off of where it is in the parent container, I believe. So if it's inside of like the main container or the footer container, then it's going to be based off of that 0 point is where we're going to start the movement from top down and left to right. So here we have the H1 has an absolute position. So it's going to be stuck to the top at 0 pixels. Then it's going to move over from the left to the right for 500 pixels and have a width of 250 pixels. And again, the paragraph width is going to be 450 pixels. So if the H1 is moving over 500 pixels, then it's going to be to the right of the paragraphs, and then the paragraphs are going to be on the left. So that's what's going on here. And as you can see, the absolute positioning also scrolls. So as you scroll down, that's going to move up with the rest of the content. Fixed positioning is similar to absolute positioning, but it's always going to stay in the position that you have defined it as. So it's not going to scroll down. It's always going to be stuck to that location. So here we're just doing top 0 and left 0. So the H1 is going to be stuck to the top of the browser window. Even if you scroll, it's not going to scroll with the rest of the content. So this is kind of fixed to the top of the browser window, and all the content's going to scroll underneath it. So when it comes to fixed positioned elements, we also have to think of how the layers are on top of each other. So we have to think of like the Z value and the depth of those objects. So if we want one element, the H1 element, to be on top and all the other elements to be underneath, then we have to play around with this value, the Z index value. And the higher that number, the higher it is going to be on the Z axis. So basically the highest value is going to be on top of everything else. The lower values are going to be underneath the higher values. So that's why this is on top of the paragraphs. If Z index for the paragraphs was 10 and Z index for the H1 was 5, for instance, then all the paragraphs would be on top of the H1 and not vice versa. So on top of positioning, we also have floating elements. So in this case, we have a block quote, like a div that has some text in it that we want the paragraphs to kind of flow around. So just like with images, how you can float them left and right and the text will flow around it, you can float HTML elements left and right as well, and the text will flow around it. So here we have a block quote, it's floating right, have a width, have some fonts, stylings, and margin, padding, and border. But because it's floating right, it's going to be on the right-hand side, and then all the text is kind of gonna flow around it. You could also float elements side by side. So if you wanted to make kind of like a grid of, for instance, if you want to have a grid of thumbnails for your portfolio and all the projects are in those thumbnails, then you could float elements side by side to make like a grid formation. So for that, you just basically want to float the elements all to the left, and then they'll kind of go to the left of each other, and then go to the next line and go to the left of each other if they have a fixed width. So in this case, the paragraphs are 230 pixels, have some margin, background color, and then we're floating them all left. So here, each one is floated to the left of each other and then go into the next line. So one little issue with that is that if like this is like super tall and the next one is super short, then the next bit of HTML element is going to be placed underneath it and then go to the next line. So to avoid that, then you can use the clear left descriptor, and then it'll just go to the next line and then be flush on the top. So when you say clear left for that particular element, then it's going to be forced to the next line and then move on from there. So we'll do this together and we'll make like a basic HTML website that has like a header, footer, and body content. So once we get into it, it'll make a little bit more sense. So yeah, so we have a div that has our paragraphs inside. The border is all the way around, but when we load it, it's only at the top. It should be all the way around the paragraphs. So that's a little bit of a problem. If we add a overflow and set it to auto, then that'll fix that problem. So now it sees that all the content, all these paragraphs are inside of this div, and it automatically changes the height of the container to accommodate for all that content. So now the line isn't just at the top, but it's all the way around. Okay, so if we wanted to have like a layout that has 2 columns, like a main content area and then like a sidebar or something, then we could have a class for column 1 and column 2. We can float them both left, give them a fixed width, give them some margin as well, and then they'll basically just be next to each other like that. So this is column 1 and column 2. Here is a very simple layout. So we have like a header at the top, like a main content area here, and then a footer at the bottom. So why don't we do this together? Why don't we just build this layout together so you have something kind of tangible to play with. We could have multiple like rows of these columns too if we wanted to as well. So let's go ahead and go back to Glitch. And I think it's probably best that we start from scratch again. So let's go click on the name and go to new project. And just Glitch hello website, it's fine. Let's delete all of the pages again. Okay, create index.html. Create a style.css. And then our index.html, we just have to add our HTML. layout example. Let's also add our link to our CSS. Okay. Let's go to our CSS and just make sure that that's working. Let's add background color of like a gray. Background color, turn in, and not link that properly. Oh, I didn't. Style.css. There we go. Yeah, let's do that gray again. Okay. So we have our basic HTML in there, and our CSS is linked. Yeah, so we're gonna basically just do the HTML first and get that in place, and then we're gonna apply our CSS styles to it to format everything. So let's do the HTML first. So we're gonna break this into 3 different groups. We're gonna have our header, our main, and our footer. So let's do that first. I think with HTML5, the latest version, you can use header as an element. You can use main, and you can use footer. Let's try that. Okay, in here, let's have like a H1, my website, and let's do an unordered list for my navigation. Home, portfolio, contacts. Okay, so that's my header information. You can make these as links too. I'm not going to link it to anything because we don't have any other pages, but just do the hashtag, then that just means it's going to load the page again, the existing page. Okay. So my links here, the navigation, my header at the top, or that could be a logo too if you wanted to. Then in here, let's do a div. Let's give this a ID of feature. Then in here we can say, okay, let's give this a H2. Let's call this is a feature section. Give it some, I'm gonna find some lorem ipsum. Nice if they had a generator and glitch. Okay. Okay, so we got some text for the feature section. And then let's do some paragraphs. Actually, let's make these divs too. And give that a class. Call it grid. Let's add a P in there. And just take some of this lorem ipsum. And I'm just going to duplicate that 3 times. Okay. So we have our feature section and then our like grid section. So that's going to be like 3 columns essentially. And then for footer, let's just say, let's give it a paragraph and say copyright Amy Widow 2021. Okay. So I think that's a pretty good like general structure for a website with a header, main content area, and then a footer. So now that we have that set up, then let's go to our CSS. So in here, let's give, let's see. Let's give the body a width, actually. Let's make it like 800 pixels. Okay, so now it's 800 pixels wide. Let's open this in a new window so we can see it. All right, cool. So it's 800 pixels wide, so it's stopping right here. So let's say our footer, or sorry, our header, let's give it a margin 0 pixels auto. Let's center it. See if that works. Nope. Okay. Let's give it a position relative. Oh, and give it a width. Let's see if that works. Let me try something. So let's do that at 800 pixels. There we go. Okay. Okay, sorry. So I got rid of that width on the body, and then I'm going to assign the width to the header, main, and footer. So let's give main, let's do the same thing. And footer, do the same thing. So this is just center aligning everything. So now it's center on the screen here. So if I scale this down, it's always center. Since this is all the same, actually, I don't need to duplicate this, to be honest. I can string this together. So I could say header, comma, main, comma, footer, comma, or no comma. Because it's basically, it all gets the same styles associated to it. So now that's centered, has a width. Let's make our columns. So that was grid, I think. So div, and then grid was the class. Let's make that a width of 33%. Okay, 33%. Let's float that to the left. Cool. Let's float it to the left. Now it's 3 columns. If you wanted to add some padding in there too, just do 10 pixels. So that pushes things around and kind of messes things up. So let's see. Okay, let's get rid of that padding for a second. Okay, so it's 33. So that's basically a third of 100%, right? So that's why that's 33.3, make it accurate. But if we want some space in between that, let's do margin 5 pixels all the way around, pushes to the next line. So that messes things up. So what we could do is say there's a calc function in CSS now. So you can say calculate 33.3% minus, let's do 10 pixels. There we go. So that kind of accommodates that padding that we added as well. Let's just add some background color. So we can see what's going on here. Okay. Background color, let's make it white. Okay. So that is also kind of messing things up because of the floating issue. So let's say, I think we have to do overflow auto for, let's do all of this, overflow auto, everything. Does that work? Yeah. Okay, cool. So the overflow auto kind of fixed the issue of the floating and the height of the container being kind of messed up. So that works. Let's add some margin to these two, 10 pixels, 0 pixels. So you can see the space in between each section. That messes up my other margin though. Sorry, so let's do 10 pixels there. There we go. And let's add some padding as well, 10 pixels. So there's some space around the content inside now. So it's starting to look more like kind of a, layout. We could float this navigation to the right too if we wanted it to be separate. So let's see, what was that called? Why don't we give this a class as well? Call it navigation or nav. So then we can float ul.nav, float that to the right. Okay, so it's over there. And let's say, okay, the h1 in header. So header h1. So going to header and then finding the h1 inside, let's float that to the left. Cool. So it's starting to come together, right? So we have a header at the top with the navigation over here. We have featured section here, and then a couple of columns below that. And then we have our footer at the bottom. So we kind of have a basic layout kind of to play with. You could obviously change the navigation too if you want it to be in line rather than on top of each other. Maybe we could try that. Let's see, display inline, I believe. Let's try that. Nope. Let's see, what was it? See, I don't remember everything. I gotta look it up too. Maybe it has to be that nav li. Try that. There we go. So it has to be applied to the li, not to the ul. And we could add some padding around that. Check that out. I don't know why this thinks, oh, because lorem ipsum thinks it's Latin. So yeah, we could play around with some positioning too. So like if we wanted header to actually be position absolute or position fixed, do that as well. Let's see. That didn't work. Position, I spelled it wrong. Okay, so now it's fixed. So now it's behind everything too. So we could also say, okay, fixed Z index. Let's just make it 10. So now it's on top of everything. And it doesn't move. But that doesn't look good, so I'm just going to get rid of that, comment it out. How would you horizontally center the navigation to the header? Horizontally center. Like center everything underneath each other. So let's see. So instead of doing float right, just comment that out. And comment out float left for the header. And that should stack them. And then if you want it to be center aligned as well, text align, center. Yeah, there we go. And text align, center. This has some padding on it by default, so we just have to remove that. Oops. Padding 0 pixels. There we go. Now it's center aligned. Is that what you were looking for, Penelope? On the same line. Okay. In that case, so that would probably be creating a display inline element. Display. Let's see if this works. Okay, it's on the same line now. And then I think we could add for the header, text align, center. That'll work. There we go. So basically, I made the block elements inline elements, just so it's treated like it would be like text in a paragraph, essentially. So they're in line with each other. And then for the container element, which is the header element, I just made all of the text center aligned, and that just moves everything in the center. We could also play around with maximum value for the width instead of just width. So for header, min, and footer, let's try max width at 800 pixels. So now it's going to max out at 800 pixels wide. But if you scale it down, so this is basically responsive website development for different browsers and different devices. So going from desktop to tablet to mobile device. So now as it scales down, it's going to scale the width of the content as well. But as you scale up, it's never going to go above 800 pixels wide. So it's good to do this, something like this for like going from laptop to iPhone, or laptop to smartphone, essentially. So it scales up, stops at a certain point, but it scales down if it needs to scale down. So that's like basic, very basic website responsive development. All right, so for homework, I basically just want you to take what we talked about today and apply it to your websites. So if you're using lists, forms, tables, images, then apply that to your website that you're working on currently. Then obviously you can start playing around with the layouts as well. So like the placement of different things, like the grouping of the header, the main content, and the footer, and then all the content that goes inside of those three buckets. Start playing around with like grid systems. If you have like a grid of thumbnails for your portfolio, or like if you're doing a restaurant or a flower store, then you probably have a grid of products as well. So you want to do that and play around with like positioning and floating elements. But yeah, basically just start incorporating everything that we talked about with CSS to your own websites. I'd like to see you have at least the home page completed with your HTML and CSS as well by next week. So at least have the homepage like perfect and beautiful when it comes to the HTML and CSS. Yeah, and then put that on your blogs and then also share that in the Slack channel so we could take a look at it and give some feedback or help if help is needed.